The history of the Cold War is one that reaches around the entire world. While some areas were true hotspots, Berlin, Cuba, and Southeast Asia to quickly name only 3 examples, there was no region on Earth that wasn't affected. But some regions receive far less attention than they deserve, sometimes to the point of largely being unknown to a wider audience. I'm your host David, and today we are going to be looking at a country and series of events that most of us are likely passingly familiar with, but have little real working knowledge of. Today we are going to look at Ethiopia in the 20th century. This is the Cold War. We're going to start this story during the late 19th century scramble for Africa, where European countries looked to expand or create empires by claiming African territory as their own. The landlocked East African country of Abyssinia, however, avoided being colonized by the nascent Kingdom of Italy, which had tried to expand beyond its foothold along the Red Sea. Despite defeating the Italians in 1896 at the decisive Battle of Adwa, the country was ultimately conquered by Fascist Italy during the Second Italo-Abyssinian War of 1935 to 1936. While sympathy remained for the outmatched underdog, Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie's appeal to the League of Nations failed to gain the necessary support to avert being taken over. This was in large part due to British and French desires to keep Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from sliding ever closer to Adolf Hitler. Ultimately, London and Paris's gambit failed as their attempt to reconcile Italian desires with the Charter of the League of Nations and the preservation of an Abyssinian rump state failed to appease either side, resulting in Italy becoming an ally of Nazi Germany. During the Second World War, Italian East Africa, which was completely cut off from the metropole, was invaded by the British, enabling Haile Selassie's return to his capital, Addis Ababa. Despite the Soviet Union's opposition to Italy's expansionist war in the 1930s, as well as earlier Russian support in the 19th century, the restored Ethiopian government opted to pivot westward, even going so far as to send its own soldiers as part of the US-backed United Nations mission during the Korean War. In 1952, as compensation and with American backing, Ethiopia was rewarded with possession of the Italian colony of Eritrea, with the intent that a federation of the two territories was to be established within 2 years. This stands in contrast to the broader trend of decolonization that would come to define the experience of much of Africa during the coming decades. We can easily see the trend by looking just at Italy's colonial territories in Africa. Ethiopia was re-established as a sovereign state. The former Ottoman provinces that had been reconfigured to create Libya under Italian rule was granted independence, while Italian Somaliland was converted into a UN trusteeship under Italian administration in anticipation for unification with neighboring British Somaliland and ultimately independence as Somalia. Eritrea stood apart, however. Strategically located along the Red Sea, it was Italy's oldest colony and was quite developed as a result. During the colonial period, Rome had invested heavily in its industrialization and sent tens of thousands of settlers to East Africa. The colony had been a major source of military recruitment, and many of these veterans would go on to participate in the Italian invasions of Ethiopia. Spoiler alert, by the way. Eritrea also had a heterogeneous population in terms of ethnicities, with some ethnic groups finding themselves in Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, some in Ethiopia, and others in French Somaliland, the modern-day Djibouti. There was also a roughly even proportion of Christians and Muslims. Now, considerable opposition existed in Eritrea towards the proposed federation. For one, a significant portion of the Muslim population was against the idea of being in union with an explicitly Orthodox Christian monarchy that had subjugated its own Muslim population. But Christian opposition also existed, with the monarchy and nobility in Ethiopia being dominated by the Amhara ethnic population, one which didn't really exist in Eritrea. The Amhara in Ethiopia had similarly marginalized other groups within the country, resulting in periodic waves of unrest and uprisings, including the 1943 Woyane Rebellion, which took place in Tigray province on the border with Eritrea. As a result of these factors, independence was the favored path forward for Eritrea instead of a union with a less developed and more feudal Ethiopia. Colonial veterans tended to lean towards a Somaliland-style trusteeship in anticipation for independence. However, with the Cold War heating up, getting colder, established anyways, US backing for Haile Selassie had already sealed Eritrea's fate. Washington was to provide Ethiopia with approximately $147 million worth of military assistance between 1953 and 1970, an amount that constituted approximately half of all American military assistance to Africa during that period. From this, Washington not only had a reliable ally in a key region, but also had access to established military facilities in Eritrea, such as the listening station at Kagnu Station, as well as a naval repair base at the deepwater harbor of Massawa. So, federation between Ethiopia and Eritrea was established, and a constitution proclaimed that allowed for an Eritrean assembly as well as substantial autonomy. Now, during the period of federation, the Eritrean economy stagnated and entered a period of decline from its heights during the colonial period, which had stimulated the economy through militarization and infrastructural investment. The federation barely lasted a decade, and Eritrea was formally annexed by Ethiopia in 1962, and the Eritrean Assembly was disbanded. As a result, many Eritreans who were already skeptical of the Union became alienated, and support for independence began to grow substantially. Emperor Haile Selassie, who, although he had had a long reign, only held a tenuous grip on power. Through political machinations, he had become regent in the 1920s before becoming emperor in 1930. However, he had faced numerous threats. In 1928, supporters of Empress Zewditu conspired before attempting an ill-fated coup. In 1936, the Italians had ousted him, and in 1960, another failed coup was launched, this time also including the commander of the Imperial Guard. Meanwhile, armed revolts in various provinces had broken out, including in the southeast, each of which were then violently suppressed. 1974, however, would prove to be his biggest challenge. Like much of the world, Ethiopia was greatly impacted by the 1973 oil crisis. Following Israel's victory in the Yom Kippur War, oil-producing Arab countries announced an embargo on countries that had supported Israel. This included Haile Selassie's Ethiopia. His support for Israel stemmed from several reasons. Part of it was rooted in ideology, with the conservative feudal monarchy claiming direct descent from King Solomon. They even practiced a more Old Testament-oriented form of Christianity. More practically, though, Israel was seen as an ally against Arab socialist-influenced movements, many of which had had an effect on the various guerrilla movements within Ethiopia. Israel had even trained some Ethiopian security forces. Some of the more notable rebel groups included the Eritrean Liberation Front, which had launched out of Egypt and received support from Ba'athist Iraq and Syria, while the Ogaden Liberation Front, operating out of the predominantly Somali province of Ogaden, got significant backing from neighboring Somalia under the rule of Siad Barre, who became a Soviet ally. Geographically, Ethiopia was isolated. In addition to Somalia to the east, there was also leftist and usually Arab nationalist governments in Sudan and across the Red Sea in South Yemen. Even anti-communist Arab governments, such as nearby Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, provided support to left-wing Eritrean rebels. So, with the oil embargo taking hold and already suffering from an El Niño-induced famine as well as general mismanagement, the Ethiopian government hiked fuel prices by 50%. The government hoped that the price increase would be absorbed by transport providers, thereby avoiding public anger, but this did not come to pass. Instead, a strike was announced by taxi drivers in Addis Ababa, crippling the city's economy. The city lacked a working public transit system due to government underinvestment, and this in turn led to inflation as the prices of everything went up and led to growing public anger. Other members of society, such as teachers and students, then joined anti-government protests. As if this wasn't bad enough, at the same time, a series of mutinies broke out across the country. Disgruntled soldiers and junior to mid-level officers not only complained about the lack of support and provisions, including water, that were not being provided to them, but also over all government mismanagement. In the summer of 1974, some of these officers from the various branches of the armed forces, as well as the police, formed the Coordinating Committee of the Armed Forces, Police, and Territorial Army, more commonly known as the Durg, meaning committee. In the coming months, the Durg managed to marginalize or remove several senior officials. Ultimately, on September 12, 1974, Haile Selassie himself was overthrown, resulting in the end of the Ethiopian monarchy. The ousted emperor was placed in detention, imprisoned in the palace, and died the following year. Disagreements still remain regarding his exact fate, ranging from natural causes due to his old age, he was 83 after all, to claims that he was murdered. Nevertheless, no matter the exact cause of his death, it was his overthrow that would have significant reverberations. First, dozens of senior political figures, noblemen, and members of the Ancien Regime were executed. Second, the Durg began utilizing left-wing rhetoric, promising land reform to replace the country's feudal structure, as well as pledging to implement a massive literacy campaign, one which was quickly rolled out to widespread success. The third impact from the ousting of a reliable American ally was a deterioration in US-Ethiopian relations, with the US refusing to provide weapons, ceasing aid, and withdrawing its forces from the country. Intended to weaken Ethiopia and force it back in line as a response to its pivot to more left-wing policies, it instead had the effect of pushing Ethiopia towards the Soviet camp. Following the establishment of the Durg, it seemed as though socialism was on the march in the region. 3 out of the 5 countries, the 3 states which also happened to be the 3 largest, straddling the southern Red Sea and the western Gulf of Aden, including the Bab el-Mandeb, the strait that connects the 2 bodies, were now under some form of Marxist-Leninist or Soviet-aligned government. One might have assumed that similar political ideologies could have contributed to regional stability. However, this thought process would prove to be short-lived as tensions grew between Ethiopia and Somalia. Now, the southern Ethiopian-Somali border had been in dispute for decades. In fact, a failure to agree to a demarcation had been used as a justification for Italy's invasion in 1935, following a clash that became known as the Walwal Incident. Not only was the border a cause of tension, but so was local discontent with Addis Ababa. In Ethiopia's ethnically Somali province of Ogaden, the Ogaden Liberation Front launched an insurgency in 1963, which was followed by direct Somali governmental intervention in 1964, resulting in the 2 neighbors fighting a 2-month-long border war. A similar process would repeat itself over a decade later. In February 1977, the Western Somali Liberation Front, the WSLF, launched its own rebellion. Like the Ogaden Liberation Front, the WSLF was also backed by Mogadishu, receiving weapons from across the border. With a separatist movement in full swing in the Ogaden region, the Somali government of Siad Barre, who had seized power in a military coup in 1969 and quickly proclaimed alignment with the Soviet Union, sought to take advantage of the moment. In a bid to enlarge its territory and establish a greater Somalia, Mogadishu invaded Ethiopia on July 13, 1977, believing that the new government in Addis Ababa was internally weak, both on the political level as well as on the provincial level. Initially, the conflict went very well for the Somalis, who made significant advances into Ethiopia, especially in friendly lowland areas. 35,000 Somali government troops, along with 250 tanks and 350 armored personnel carriers, pushed across the border, backing the WSLF before their advance stalled. This left Moscow in a rather awkward position, having provided weapons and support to both sides. Initially, the Soviet government sought a ceasefire, but after that failed, decided to side fully with Ethiopia. This included 1,000 advisors, as well as 100,000 tons of military equipment, which was 3 times more than the entire existing Ethiopian stock. Shortly after, other socialist countries offered material support as well, ranging from East Germany to North Korea. Meanwhile, some countries even sent troops, which would prove to be decisive. This included approximately 17,000 Cuban troops, some of who had previously gained combat experience in the Cold War hotspot of Angola, as well as Cuban pilots commanding MiGs, Sukhois, and Mi-8 helicopters. South Yemen, for its part, contributed a tank battalion. Combined, this backing by foreign governments helped Ethiopia avert disaster, and instead, a successful counterattack was launched. However, not all socialist governments backed the Ethiopians. With Sino-Soviet relations still tense, Beijing sought to exploit the break between Moscow and Mogadishu by backing the Somalis. So while fortune had seemed to favor Somalia in the summer of 1977, by the fall of that year, the momentum had decisively shifted in favor of the Ethiopians. The vast terrain left the Somalis overstretched, having failed to deal a fatal blow. Hopes for a governmental collapse in Addis Ababa were misplaced, with the conflict instead resulting in a consolidation of government power in the face of a common enemy, despite significant issues with morale, particularly in the early stages of the war. On March 5, 1978, Ethiopian forces took the town of Jijiga, approximately 70 kilometers west of the Somali-Ethiopian border. By March 9th, the Somali government announced its withdrawal from the Ogaden region, with their withdrawal becoming complete on March 15th and the WSLF effectively defeated. On March 23rd, the Ethiopian government announced it had retaken the last frontier post. The conflict resulted in over 6,000 military fatalities on each side, with the total number of killed, wounded, and captured or missing estimated at 30,000 people. On top of that, approximately 400 Cubans, 100 Yemenis, and 33 Soviets also died. Roughly 500,000 people are believed to have been displaced by the conflict. Having lost the war, Siad Barre would eventually turn to the west for support before eventually fleeing the country, resulting in the country's collapse beginning in the late 1980s and sparking a civil war there that still persists to this day. The Ogaden War only lasted between July 1977 and March 1978, but it would have a transformative effect. It brought Ethiopia even closer to the Eastern Bloc while further boosting its military strength and self-confidence. With this now in hand, the Durg would reorient its military capabilities internally in an effort to defeat guerrilla forces. The Ogaden War coincided with a radicalization of the Ethiopian Revolution. The Durg initially showed some willingness to work with pre-existing leftist organizations, but this diminished relatively quickly. Groups like the All Ethiopia Socialist Movement, Mason, at first backed the Durg following the Ethiopian Revolution, but found themselves increasingly marginalized. A failed assassination attempt on Mengistu Haile Mariam, the head of the Durg and Ethiopian head of state since early 1977, led to an increased crackdown, particularly on the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, despite that it had initially supported the Ethiopian Revolution. Mengistu announced a Red Terror that would eventually claim tens, and by some estimates, hundreds of thousands of lives as government and government-aligned actors were permitted free action to take on their enemies. The most significant rebel movement was in, you guessed it, Eritrea. The conflict began in 1961 when rebels belonging to the Eritrean Liberation Front, the ELF, under the command of Hamid Idris Awate, launched the first attack on Ethiopian forces. The fighters had initially organized abroad, primarily in Arab countries such as Egypt, and then later also in Sudan and Algeria, even modeling itself in part on the latter's successful National Liberation Front. To some extent, their efforts were influenced by contemporaneous pan-Arab movements, which was further reinforced by additional support from the governments of Iraq and Syria. For the Ethiopian government, Eritrea was seen as vital territory since it was Ethiopia's access to the sea, without which it would become landlocked once again. Albeit a secular movement, the ELF was noted for its predominantly Muslim membership. This caused some uneasiness with some Christian members, a concern that continued to grow as the ELF's reliance and interaction with Arab governments increased. Ultimately, the Eritrean movement split into two, with the breakaway Eritrean People's Liberation Front emerging, though neither side was by any means homogeneous, with both having significant numbers of Highland Christians and lowland Muslims from various ethnic groups. The Eritrean War of Independence, which predates and was subsumed into the wider Ethiopian Civil War, experienced its own factional civil war between the ELF and EPLF. That's right, a civil war inside a civil war. It's like Inception. Research by people such as Boston College Peter Krause suggests that the presence of competing rebel forces reduces the likelihood of a rebel victory, even if they share a common enemy. In a bid for hegemony within the Eritrean rebel movement, the two sides came to clash, resulting in the EPLF displacing the ELF as the predominant guerrilla force. The EPLF was noted for its sophisticated and effective organization. While much of their armaments and equipment were captured from government forces or smuggled across the border via the Sudanese border town of Kassala, the EPLF also established small-scale workshops that produced uniforms and spare parts for weapons, as well as provided medical care and education in rebel-controlled areas. In addition, it stood out for having a large female contingent comprising roughly 30% of their fighters. But, as the saying goes, it's never so bad that it can't get worse. In Ethiopia's case, this was certainly what happened between 1983 and 1985, when the country was hit with a major famine. Famines were by no means unusual in Ethiopia and tended to occur approximately every decade, being caused by everything from drought to locust invasions to animal-borne diseases. Keep in mind that despite his pledges to modernization, Emperor Haile Selassie had left the country with poor infrastructure, making relief efforts much harder for socialist Ethiopia, resulting in heavy reliance on aid being delivered by air, a far more expensive endeavor. Some of the problems were also self-inflicted. The intense civil war included the widespread use of landmines, leaving otherwise arable land unavailable. In addition, the government pursued a policy of resettlement and villagization. Ostensibly, it was intended to help people move to new areas that were not famine-stricken, as well as bring together individual homesteads in order to improve access to water, education, and medical care, which could be more easily done with increased population density. According to Mengistu, collecting the farmers into villages will enable them to promote social production in a short time. It will also change a farmer's life, his thinking, and will therefore open a new chapter in the establishment of a modern society in their rural areas and help bring about socialism. While some of those motives were sincere, it was also heavily guided by counterinsurgency objectives, such as weakening rural support for the rebels by cutting them off from one another. Villagers that had previously practiced a mixture of farming and herding were forced to abandon the latter. Offensives that coincided with planting seasons also harmed the agricultural sector. In addition, the restrictions on internal movement and greater demands by the government in order to sustain cities and the military further contributed to turning a drought into a massive famine. The government prioritized heavily state-owned or controlled coffee farms, which were seen as an essential lifeline since coffee exports were the country's leading export and a major source of hard currency. The significant need for hard currency also impacted Ethiopia's relationship with East Germany. East Germany was experiencing its own coffee shortage, but since the commodity was viewed by Erich Honecker and the East German leadership as a necessity in preventing German unrest, it had offered Ethiopia military support in exchange for that liquid gold. During a visit to East Germany in October 1977, Mengistu said, "Thanks to the GDR's aid, it was possible to equip and feed 100,000 men of the People's Militia." In this way, the GDR played a significant role in the revolutionary development of Ethiopia. However, within less than a year, the agreement broke down. Even as East Germany offered more aid, infrastructure projects, agricultural machinery, and training, which Politburo member Werner Lamberts argued would be more effective than pure reliance on armed strength, Ethiopia ended the agreement, demanding hard currency, which in turn resulted in growing dissatisfaction in East Germany towards its government as a result of the ongoing coffee shortage. The Germans would turn to Vietnam to meet its coffee needs, but more on that in a later episode. The Ethiopian famine, which one BBC journalist described as biblical, caught worldwide attention. Countries on both sides of the Iron Curtain sent aid as images of starving children permeated the world press. It also led to some of the most high-profile musical examples of humanitarian relief efforts. After watching a news report on the famine, the artist Bob Geldorf helped bring together a group of artists who, under the name Band-Aid, performed the song "Do They Know It's Christmas?" The song was an immense success, and the following summer, Geldorf organized Live Aid, a benefit concert that occurred simultaneously in London and Philadelphia. The concert brought together some of the biggest names in music, including Queen, David Bowie, Elton John, U2, The Beach Boys, Run DMC, Madonna, Bob Dylan, and many others. Geldorf was not the only one to lead such an effort. Following the success of Do They Know It's Christmas?, Harry Belafonte sought to replicate its achievements, first by recruiting Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie as songwriters and Quincy Jones as a producer. The result was We Are the World, which also featured artists like Bruce Springsteen, Cyndi Lauper, Stevie Wonder, and many more. For the British government, such efforts created mixed results. On the one hand, public and global reaction to the famine meant that the government was inclined to provide aid, which it did. On the other hand, Britain's Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was worried that by providing aid, the government was indirectly propping up the Durg. This led to internal discussions on whether or not to seek to undermine and thereby potentially assist with the overthrow of the Durg. The Soviet Union was the Ethiopian government's biggest ally, providing massive support that turned Ethiopia into one of Africa's biggest military powers. However, the two were not always aligned. In particular, the Soviet government sought to reconcile the Durg and rebels, many of whom already adhered to one form of socialism or another, including Marxism-Leninism, as well as other varieties, including Albanian-inspired Hoxhaism and Maoism. Mikhail Gorbachev's 1985 rise to power in Moscow reduced crucial Soviet backing for Addis Ababa. Gorbachev initiated the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, the removal of Soviet troops from Eastern Europe, as well as faced American pressure to cut back support for governments across the world as part of improving East-West relations. This timing could not have been worse for the People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, which had been established following the adoption of a 1987 constitution that sought to transition the country to civilian rule under the Workers' Party of Ethiopia. The PDRE had been founded in 1984 and still included many military officials, including Mengistu, in leading roles. As for the impact of Soviet reductions in support, not only were the rebels on the advance and the Ethiopian military heavily exhausted by having to fight a multi-front counterinsurgency that spanned from flat plains to mountains, it would also coincide with an internal challenge to the ruling power. As casualties mounted, exhaustion set in, and no end was in sight, some officers began to conspire against Colonel Mengistu. During the latter's 4-day state visit to East Germany in May 1989, officers launched a coup. Within days, government loyalists successfully crushed the putschists, with several of the plotters either killed or later executed. While the government was not overthrown, its days were numbered. The last few years of the conflict consisted of a string of rebel victories. At the Battle of Alphabet, possibly the largest battle in Africa since the Second World War, and compared by some to Dien Bien Phu, EPLF forces killed, wounded, or captured or dispersed approximately 15,000 government troops, as well as captured 3 Soviet officers. The defeat was so significant that for the first time ever, Mengistu acknowledged publicly what the whole world already knew, that the country was in a state of war. In Tigray, 4 divisions were defeated and 12,000 government forces surrendered in February 1989. In 1990, the vital port city of Massawa fell to the rebels. Simultaneously, various rebel groups began coordinating. EPLF and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, in particular collaborated together. In addition, the latter also helped create a pan-Ethiopian rebel alliance known as the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, the EPRDF. Combined with the end of Soviet support and continued exhaustion, the People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia was teetering on the brink of collapse. In the spring of 1991, as EPLF rebels took the Eritrean capital of Asmara and EPRDF forces advanced closer to Addis Ababa, Mengistu Haile Mariam fled the country, initially traveling to neighboring Kenya before finally settling in Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, Mengistu found sympathy from the authorities, who rewarded the former Ethiopian leader for his support for Robert Mugabe's rebel movements during the waning years of white minority rule in the southern African pariah state of Rhodesia. In Addis Ababa, the EPRDF established a transitional government that lasted until 1995, when the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia was established. The TPLF would go on to dominate Ethiopian politics until 2018. Despite having fought for 30 years, Eritrean guerrillas, now in control over the entire province, agreed to wait 2 years before holding an independence referendum, which went ahead in 1993, resulting in over 99% of the population voting in favor of independence. Following its victory, the EPLF became the People's Front for Democracy and Justice. Despite both countries being ruled by former allies, Eritrea and Ethiopia would go to war again between 1998 and 2000. Though an agreement was nominally reached in Algiers in 2000, border tensions remained, and it was not until 2018 that both sides declared peace. Meanwhile, the TPLF fell out of power and clashed with its own government, as well as neighboring Eritrea, resulting in the Tigray War between 2020 and 2022. The history of 20th century Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa is a complicated one, dominated by authoritarian governments and shifting allegiances in ongoing conflicts. These conflicts, like so many during the Cold War, were fueled by ideology, but ultimately had at their root nationalist identities based on ethnic and regional identifications. But with the international community fixated on the ideological component, they intervened, both directly and indirectly, into these conflicts as part of their own wider aims on the global stage. The destabilizing impacts of decades of conflict continue to impact the lives of ordinary people, with threats of resumed fighting and destabilization never far from the surface. Just one more legacy of the Cold War. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is organizing a massive charity concert involving all of your top current musical celebrities, none of whom I have ever heard of because I am just that old now. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.